let's just dive right in. If folks have questions, please feel free to use the chat and then I can queue those up for Ryan. I have some questions that people submitted ahead of time. I have a few questions of my own for you as well. In general, we'll be talking about B2B podcasting, which is, it's a big umbrella. It's a lot under that. We'll of course link to the previous AMA that we did together, Ryan, but maybe first, just for new folks, could you give a brief intro to yourself and your business, Podsicle Media?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks so much for doing this. The first one was a lot of fun, and I think there was a lot of value in it. And I'm looking forward to this session as well. I'm Ryan Tabb. I'm the founder and CEO of Podsicle Media. Podsicle Media, we produce podcasts for B2B brands, which, as you said, is a big umbrella. So that ranges from marketing companies to cybersecurity companies and everything in between there. We handle everything from the pre-launch process, building out what the proper show strategy is, putting together the assets for the show, into actual ongoing production and all the work that goes into that. And our goal, we really just try and enable companies to launch podcasts without adding a ton to their internal responsibilities.
Cool. I love it. I love it. Do you want to just dive right into this? I have a question ready to go for you that
Let's do it.
Lindsay McGuire submitted this in Slack. She asked, do you have any creative ideas for getting hype started before the launch of a new season? We're about to get into season 6, that's pretty impressive, of FormStack's Practically Genius podcast. Looking for some fresh promo ideas going into the trailer and first episode.
That's actually very funny. I just connected with her on LinkedIn and I just sent her a message saying that I like that podcast. But small world. Season 6, that's really impressive. I mean, a lot of companies don't make it out of season 1 whole. So to get to 6 of them is great. I think for building hype, the biggest thing is, especially if you're producing seasonally, you'll have a backlog of episodes. And so leveraging the guests that you're bringing on for a company like FormStack, that should be pretty doable. And that's the big thing about podcasts. You've got that halo effect of having your guests as basically advocates for your show, providing them with all the assets, making sure there's a system in place there. So not just, hey, here's a Google Drive file that has all the assets. Sorry about my phone ringing there.
Okay.
Besides just, not just saying, hey, here's a Google Drive file with all the assets, but actually saying, here are 4 assets. Here's the way we recommend that you share them. Here's the places they can be shared. That's really the most powerful way to do it, because that's ultimately how people who aren't familiar with it yet are most likely going to find the podcasters, through people that they're already familiar with who are appearing on it, or people in their networks who find it interesting and share it. So I wish there was a magic button to just kickstart a lot of interest and excitement. But it is super organic, and leveraging all that is going to be your best bet.
That's cool. Do you have any suggestions for how to facilitate that? I could imagine you send someone a script or like a pre-written tweet or LinkedIn post and just say like, hey, post this. Maybe that works. Maybe it's not personal enough. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So the way we have it, broken down is that we follow up with everyone once before the episode is live to let them know what they can expect to receive. And then once the episode is live, to actually send them, hey, here's the content from your episode. And then again, it's like you said, there's going to be some tweet suggestions or LinkedIn suggestions or whatever the platform is. But they're usually going to make their own tweaks to that. So it's not going to, because we use our brand voice and they have their own voice. It's going to be on their personal page and they have a personal voice. So we suggest, hey, here are the points that we talked about. Here are the key things to mention. But typically they're going to rephrase that in their own way, even if we wrote it out word for word.
Yeah. And do you keep track of that? You know what I mean? Like, do you track to make, like, do you follow up to make sure people post stuff, or is that is it a step too far?
It's a step too far. I mean, once they've given you their time, once they've come on the podcast, usually people do share. Like, we keep track of it, not in any formal way, just we're aware of whether or not people are sharing. And it's very rare that somebody's not interested in sharing a podcast that they participated in. I mean, half the excitement in joining a podcast is to then be able to turn around and redistribute that to your network. So if they're not doing that, typically that's kind of a red flag about maybe they had a bad experience, or maybe they weren't proud of the answers they shared, or maybe they were just shy or embarrassed and put themselves out there, but that was too much for them and they didn't want to take it a step further. Most people who come on a show are very eager to share it. Typically run into issues there.
It's kind of interesting you say this, because I was on a podcast recently and they asked me to share, and I was actually quite happy to, because they asked a bunch of questions that I had never been asked before. I feel like it just made for more interesting content, rather than I've been on a series of podcasts about like content marketing and digital marketing, and I end up saying a lot of the same things over and over again. It's like not that, I'm like, do I really want to clog my feed with like me saying the same thing I said in the last podcast I promoted, but good questions made for new answers, which made me excited to then go out and share it.
Right. And so everything starts with your podcast quality. If you're asking generic questions and getting generic answers, and you're having somebody on who's been on a lot of shows, you're going to run into a problem there with exactly what you said. And again, the whole thing is that podcasting, maybe more so than any other medium, straddles this really unique line between promotional content and truly organic content. And so for people to want to share that on their page, nobody's going to share it like your company's going to share it. Like if you have 5 assets from each episode that you're planning to share Monday through Friday, the week of an episode release, the guest is probably not going to be sharing an asset every day, because their primary motive with their LinkedIn page is not to promote your podcast, but they're going to share 1 or 2 that they find really exciting. So I guess that's the other kind of qualifier I should put on that is expectations and how guests are going to be sharing. It's going to look different from how your company is going to share it, because your company's solely focused on promoting your company, and they have a lot of other things that they're focused on, including their own company on their own page. So you might get 1 or 2 shares out of them versus every piece of content you send their way.
Right. Actually, while we're on the topic of, I'll loosely call this guest experience, I'll give a shout out to Verblio's Content Bounce House podcast. That's the one I was referencing, that they just ask new questions, and I thought it was really interesting. They also did a thing for all their guests where they have an artist do like a pencil sketch of the guest's like profile photo.
Yeah.
Which then, then they create some artwork that goes out with it. It actually felt really personal. And then, they say, if you want it, you can use it for other things. I thought that was really cool. No idea how much that cost. I can't imagine it's that expensive.
No, I mean, I think that's the big thing is just like, if you think about guest experience similar to like gifting platforms, right? The question isn't really how can we spend the most money to get somebody's attention, but how can we do something unique that feels good for them and creates a relationship? And so I think about that with business gifting platforms. If you then take that and apply it to podcasting, it's the same thing. Do we have to get the most expensive sketch artist in the world? No, but is it also the only podcast you've been on that gave you a sketch of yourself? Yes. So that's
cool.
Pretty neat. And if you can think of unique ways to do that stuff, it's always going to enhance the guest experience. I mean, I can say with confidence that anybody who receives that kind of stuff from an appearance is going to be a lot more eager to share the content, promote the content. I mean, even just you shouting them out right now is an example of that.
True. Yeah. I guess that's true. Yeah, we do swag. Like I like to send people hoodies and hats and coffee mugs and stuff like that. I read somewhere that in the early days of his podcast, Tim Ferriss would actually send guests Yeti mics because audio quality was a huge issue in 2014 or whenever this was getting rolling. So he would spend $100 or $150 and send each guest a mic as like a thank you for doing it. But also it made his podcast sound a whole lot better than all the other ones out there. So, I mean, that barrier has been overcome now. Like most people have access to good audio equipment. Even AirPods are pretty good now. But it just makes me think there must be like a million things, little things you could do to make your guests happy, make your podcast even stand out to them, to incentivize them. So,
and that's everything in the marketing world, right?
Yeah.
There's something that people jump onto, then everybody's doing it, and that thing's no longer special in its own right and innately. And so you have to find other ways to elevate that experience to be special, whether it's your customer service or your podcast or anything else.
There was another related to this thing I wanted to ask you about. We did an office hours last week with a guy named John Collins, and he led content marketing for Intercom from the very beginning, like helped launch their blog, spent about 7 years there. And one of the things that he described was that he had a lot of like really big content ideas and they were pretty expensive. And one of the things he did to get buy-in was, as he presented those plans for the content, he would include as part of them ways to repurpose just about everything.
Mm-hmm.
Podcasting became part of that, interestingly. So like, as an example, they did a series of ebooks, and instead of just creating PDFs, they printed physical books. They made Kindle versions, and then they created an audiobook, which they then published as a podcast. And then as they did interview series on the blog, okay, now they've got a podcast feed up and running. If they were going to interview someone for part of an article, they would also repurpose that audio to use in a podcast. So I guess there's sort of 2 pieces of this question, one broad, one specific. The broad is, how do you think about content, the version of it that I think of, which is primarily text content, working together with an audio strategy?
Yeah.
And then related to that, I think that it seems obvious that you could take a podcast and create written content, or you could take written content and find ways to create audio content. Do you think one works better than the other?
Yeah. So to answer the first question, there's a lot of ways to repurpose, and I think it depends on. I might be missing the question a little just because I got focused on the second one, so I want to make sure.
Yeah.
Can you just restate the question for me? The first part.
The first one would be basically how do you think companies should integrate
Sure. Okay.
text and audio as part of like a larger content strategy?
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, and I mentioned this on the first AMA, if you look at podcasting like blogging, but without having to worry about SEO optimization, you see how powerful it can be. So because everything's organic, yes, that is a complicated factor in driving listeners, something you don't have working to your advantage if you take advantage of best practices in SEO and you're writing a blog. But you have total freedom to actually provide value to your customers or to your prospects in the exact way that they are wanting it, because you don't have to worry about keyword stuffing or H1s or anything like that. And so with that in mind, the relationship, I think, always favors, this is kind of leading into that second question, creating the audio content first. So starting with what really is most useful for your audience, and then taking that, crafting it into an SEO optimized post with those best practices, drawing from that episode, being able to say, these are the 10 things we touched on. These ones are most suitable as H1s and H2s, and this is better suited as the end of the blog post and all that stuff. So I think there is a really strong relationship there in helping identify what's most important and then taking that and translating it into written content that's going to rank. If you do both of those things well, and you even take it a step further and integrate the two, where you have audio clips from the episode spliced in throughout the blog so that people are getting 5-minute audio clips after a paragraph that touches on something, then there's even more engagement and it's just a lot higher value. But I think if you start with a blog post where you've written it somewhat with Google in mind, and then you try and turn that into a podcast, you're kind of pigeonholing yourself.
Yeah. That's interesting. That might be like a good barometer for helping people decide if what they're writing is worth publishing. Like if you read it out loud on a podcast, would it sound like it was written for a search engine?
Yeah.
I was talking to a company recently, and actually, forgive me if this was you, Ryan, but they were basically explaining that they were trying to create like a subject matter expertise database for their marketing and sales teams to use.
It wasn't me, so I'm curious.
Okay, so basically what they were doing was, anytime anyone talked to a customer or a prospect, they would record that and it would go into a Notion database, and then they were tagging it by like topics discussed. And then not all of it was available to be published because, it's not all meant for that. But it became, the idea was that anyone or sales and marketing, if they were curious about like, what does a customer think about this or that, they could go in here and they could search transcripts and filter by topics and find stuff. I feel like as like a text content person, like that's my background. I'm assuming like I'm working alongside a podcast person. If we could just be like feeding stuff into that, like it's such an amazing way to make these connections with people in the industry and customers. It's just like another, like maybe a little way, but just like another way to like just extract a little bit more value. And also just sort of keep the focus on the customer. It's always so important in the content marketing world to begin with. It's just like a really easy way to go about that.
I mean, if you're building a business and you're building out a database like that, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to utilize it in content. And as far as podcasting goes, I mean, those are just resources to reach out to now. When you have, let's say you're writing a blog post, and this is kind of what you were mentioning, you can go and reference that and say, we need somebody to speak on this for a paragraph in this blog post, but turn it into a podcast episode too, and reach out to those people and say, hey, we're wanting to talk about how IT leaders are solving this specific problem. And, we already have a relationship with this person. I think if you reach out after having established a relationship, your odds are that much better that you're going to get someone to appear on the podcast. And then again, take the podcast, turn it into a blog post, turn it into video content, and you've got so much more to do with it now.
Do you feel that some companies clutter their podcast feeds?
Oh yeah.
I guess as an example, like, like you have a podcast about whatever, but then like you have a conference, and then you like take the recordings of the speakers and dump that stuff in there. Like, is that a step too far when it comes to repurposing?
A step too far, maybe not. I mean, to each their own, but it's definitely not my ideal way of organizing things. It does disappoint me when I go to a company's website and I click on their podcast link and the resources, and it just takes me to like a blog where they've auto applied the podcast filter to any content that they've checked is podcast content, because you end up getting things like webinars and all that.
Yeah.
And I do think a podcast series that's well produced has a lot of intention behind it that the webinars aren't meeting. And the webinars are powerful and important in their own way. So I would really encourage companies that are starting podcasts to specifically focus on podcasting as a standalone type of content, even though it's intertwined with the other content categories. If somebody's navigating to your podcast page, there shouldn't be webinars there. There shouldn't be blog posts there. Maybe the episode page itself can include the blog post, but it should be very clearly the show that you're producing. And to add on to that, clutter in a different perspective, this is a question that from a business perspective for me, the answer doesn't align with my financial goals, but I think there's like all this recommendation that if you can produce a weekly podcast, you should. And from a production standpoint, we charge more for weekly podcasts. I'd love to say that everybody should produce weekly, but that's another form of clutter. Do you have interviews that you can source on a weekly basis? Do you have ideas that you can bring to the table on a weekly basis that are actually going to be useful? Because nobody's going to binge a podcast where half of the episodes are filler. If you're watching a Netflix show, you don't binge if every episode doesn't leave on a cliffhanger or develop the story or add something. So if you want people to binge the content, it has to be intentional. It has to be quality content. I don't think most companies can do that on a weekly basis. And that's not a knock on most companies. That's just, I think it takes time to develop a really interesting conversation with a lot to add to your customer and to source the right guests. And if you're constantly up against the calendar as your primary motivation for recording, you're not going to be putting out excellent content. You will get a ton of stuff to repurpose, and I'm sure you can find great insights from each episode. So it's not that it's inherently worse, but I just don't think that strategy works for most companies. And it's clutter.
That's interesting. There's a podcast I listened to that recently went from every Monday to every Monday and Wednesday, but they're essentially two different shows.
Yeah.
And I get it. Like I do get it, because this single stream thing, like you've built up a subscriber base in this one place. It seems crazy to that. If you want to expand the podcast, it seems crazy to start a new feed and start from zero.
Yeah. No, there's totally room for doing multiple shows a week. There are daily shows that are really good, but a daily show, typically speaking, either has a big team behind it, and so they are able to source guests at that frequency where around the clock they're booked out 10 weeks in advance with all of their guests lined up. And so they know they're getting good guests and somebody's helping produce the episode in the pre-production phase, so they know what they're going to talk about. Or their daily shows where they're not as much about creating true thought leadership and really going in depth. If you want to have conversations that are just interesting, but not necessarily going to be providing or uncovering really unique insights, go daily, go weekly. But I think for most companies, if their goal is you're going to come away from I always say somebody should come away from your episode in the B2B world smarter than before they tuned into it. That should be the primary measurement that you use for if something's ready for publishing. Did I come away better off than before I listened to it? Entertainment matters, enjoying it matters, but at the end of the day, people are listening because it helps advance their career and their job and their business. That's what's happening in the B2B podcast world, and you need to provide that. I don't think most companies can really do that on a daily or twice a week or even weekly basis.
Yeah.
And that's fine because your content's going to be better for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that, when I think of B2B podcasts, or I think most people probably think of like interview-based shows, it's like, you're in this niche, so you find influential people in that niche and you interview them. And are there examples of B2B podcasts that don't do that?
Yeah. So there are a lot of companies out there. It's typically the enterprise companies that are doing scripted content, highly produced stuff. And I think the big thing that you're trying to balance, if you're considering that, is how much is switching to a model that's going to require a lot more work going to advance the goals that we've set for this podcast. So if you are, an enterprise company like Salesforce, right? If you're Salesforce and you have basically unlimited resources, then your primary goal for your podcast is probably a bunch of different ways to define quality content being published. But if you're a smaller company, you're going to be more focused on, is this actually helping advance our prospects into customers? Is it driving leads in some way, even if it's not direct lead generation? Right. So does scripting a show advance those goals? Probably not. Does it increase the quality? And if you're a big company that's focused on just putting out the highest quality content in all avenues, go that route. And there are in-house teams that do it wonderfully. There are agencies that do it wonderfully. But for that exact reason, our agency typically doesn't do that. With exceptions, we assemble teams for that if our clients really want it. But interview shows are the bread and butter for most B2B organizations because you end up putting in so much more work and it's disproportionate to the rewards that you're going to reap unless you are in that Salesforce kind of category or that HubSpot category where it's not really about the specific metrics from each content channel as much as it is building out an entire media arm.
Right. Got it. That's interesting. As you and I have discussed, a podcast is in Superpath's future at some point. And one of the things I'd like to do is a mailbag. And I don't think it's not going to carry a podcast, but I imagine it as like a segment in a podcast that, like, depending on the week, maybe you've got some really interesting listener submitted questions to talk through, and if you don't have somebody one week, okay, you can sort of focus on something else. But like, do you find that like a kind of like a modular format can work? There's different segments that you can kind of plug and play depending on what's going on that week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd call that semi-produced, right? It's
Okay.
not full like high scale production where we're script writing and everything, but there's a level of planning that goes into that beyond show up for the conversation, and that's the show. My
Right.
background before podcasting and before marketing was in radio, and radio is super modular in terms of segments. So Thursday on a radio show might have totally different segments than the same show's Tuesday episode. And I think that there's a lot of value in that podcasting hasn't yet drawn from. So whether it's mailbags or even potentially games that are involved in it, radio shows love doing games. You're not going to have that live element, but there's ways you could translate that stuff. You're going to increase the engagement, especially let's take the mailbag example. If somebody asks a question, the likelihood that they're tuning into that episode for the answer is very, very high.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's more than just, okay, we're providing value and we're making sure that we're hitting those goals that I talked about earlier. Is somebody coming away better off than they started? But also, are we giving them a reason to listen as soon as it goes live? Are we giving them a reason to subscribe, to share? Yes, I would say unequivocally is the answer if you're doing those kinds of segments.
Got it. How about evergreen content? I mean, I feel like there's something, like in the text content where we talk a lot about evergreen content because it's, it's like relatively easy to get that stuff out there and let it be discovered whenever people want it. Is there an analogous thing in audio content, or is it just because everything is sort of, all podcasts sort of run the same way? It's like sort of episodic. It goes through the feed, is it just kind of too difficult to figure that out?
So it's not that it's not relevant in the audio world. And also I'll just add this because this is coming up on so many of my calls. At this point, podcasting really, at least in the business world, doesn't mean audio anymore. I think people always ask me, oh, do you guys do video? And I have to be like, yes, we don't do a single podcast that doesn't include video.
Oh,
so it's at least worth putting that out there. Actually, we have one client who does just audio, but other than that,
meaning like you record a video like this, and then
right.
that version also gets published on YouTube or somewhere.
Yeah, so it's just funny for me always to hear this referred to as audio content, and I even do it. I call it that too. But at the end of the day, it is similar to a webinar and what you can expect from the audio and visual elements, but there's just a different spin on how you're producing and what you're preparing it for and distributing it. Anyway, to answer your question with the evergreen stuff in mind, to me, it's always a back burner thing. It's something to keep in mind. So most companies, whether it's one season or 6 seasons like FormStack or Drift, where you have tons of shows and tons of seasons, most companies will typically reach an end of their podcast at some point. And that is hours and hours of valuable content that you don't want to just disappear. So there needs to be some evergreen element to it, because even those companies that haven't published their podcast in a year still have their podcast on their website. And I'm sure still get a solid amount of clicks from people navigating to it or discovering it in the podcast listening apps. So just because you stop producing doesn't mean people stop clicking. And then if you want those clicks to translate into something meaningful, the value has to still apply a year or 2 years later. But they don't live like a blog lives, where you can go back and refresh content. And so there is a like a ceiling there to what you can do, because if you have a really compelling discussion about marketing best practices 4 years ago, those best practices just don't apply now, and there's nothing you can do about that. And so that is the limitation of the medium in that way. So I think you keep it as a back of mind sort of thing. It shouldn't drive your strategy.
Yeah, that's interesting. This tool may exist, but there's a tool in the tech space called Authory, which is like a tool for writers to make profiles. You sign up and it will automatically go find any articles you've ever written. I could imagine a similar thing where like, as a way to sort of help make audio content more evergreen, that like, I would love to be able to shift like a list of any podcast I've ever been on. You know what I mean? Like if my name was in the thing, that it like pulls it together in one place, and then, whatever. I could imagine a few ways that I would use that. And then you could probably like sort by topic and things like that as well.
As far as I know, that doesn't exist, but it does sound like something that'd be really great. And kind of speaking to that, there's a lot of tools that don't exist in podcasting that should.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so the technical side of the medium, like actually understanding how RSS feeds work, and then how those have been complicated by Spotify and by Apple, and how they independently distribute that content in their own way. There are a lot of restrictions on what can actually be built. There's so many great ideas that could exist in the podcasting world, and the bedrock that it's built on is just not technically enabled for that kind of stuff. And that will never change. That's the really, really sad part about it. The entire podcast industry would have to be turned on its head for any of that to change. And unfortunately, that's just not going to happen. Like there are billions and billions of dollars put into consumer podcast advertising, and still we're using broken technology. So if that's not enough to turn the industry on its head, then nothing will be. So the question is, with tools like that, how do you work around it? I think AI is going to help play a role, right? So we can't index podcast episodes the way we can index blogs, but there are companies out there that are working on speech to text and then indexing the speech to text of each episode.
That's really interesting.
And then giving you a search engine that allows you to search through podcasts beyond just the tags that the producers, the companies behind it are posting. So there's a lot of tools, but everything has to be a workaround.
Yeah.
Could that exist one day? Absolutely. If they've indexed every podcast and they can search for your name, and you can assume that the speech to text has accurately captured your name every appearance, then great. But otherwise, unless it's in the description, which it would be if you're the guest or tagged in it, but maybe if it's your company that gets mentioned just briefly and it's not something that's in the description, you'd want to know, but that's not possible right now. Whereas if your company's mentioned in a blog post, you can go and find that.
Yeah, that's, it kind of sounds like running a Slack community.
Yes.
Everything is Slack, so like therefore, like everything else is duct taped together.
Well, the way it RSS, really simple syndication. It's basically just an audio file that is in a standardized format that all of these players can say, hey, somebody wants this, please push us this data. But there's nothing else to it besides a link to an audio file. If you actually click on an RSS feed and go inspect it, there are text-based pieces of information about the episode, and then a link to a hosted audio file. It's really that simple. There's nothing more to it. You could listen just by using that link, by clicking through to it and listening in your web browser. You don't need a podcast player like Spotify or Apple. And that's the idea. It was so simple in the earlier days that anybody could do it and anybody could receive it. But now we're bound by that simplicity.
Right. That's so interesting. You touched on transcripts, and I wanted to ask you about that. So Sierra, our content manager, recently wrote a piece about making your website more accessible, and specifically making your content marketing more accessible. Transcripts are a big thing for so actually we're going through and trying to figure out, should we add transcripts to all of our video and audio content? We went down this road a little bit. It's like a little more complicated than I thought, because the AI tools are like really close, but it's like, is somebody going to go through then and like fix all the words they get wrong? And so you can use Rev or some other like human powered company to do it, but then it starts to get really expensive to do a whole website. Should you do it? Should you not? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it really just comes down to your budget. I would recommend using Rev. We use Rev for transcriptions. They do a really good job, and it's relatively affordable. I would say, yes, it's always going to be cheaper to start with AI and then go through the AI transcript and correct it, but that takes a lot of time. And with Rev for a 30-minute podcast, you're looking at $40, $42 to get that transcript. It's not nothing, but it's also just something that I think companies should bake into their budget for this type of content if they really want to do it start to finish in the most sound way possible. No pun intended. I guess it's not the sound way, it's the written way. Yeah. But I just think it's up to a company's really own discretion. I know there are a lot of people who enjoy reading transcripts as the podcast plays. And I know there are people who can't hear content and need to read a transcript. So if that's a priority for your company, then I would say $40 is a small investment. But if you're doing tons of content, all types of video, multiple podcasts, yeah, then it's not $40, then it's $400, and that's up and up.
Right. For what it's worth, the best AI version of this that we've come across so far is called Grain, which plugs into Zoom, records your call, and then afterwards you get the transcript alongside the video, all timestamped, and then the word is highlighted as you go. And it's really easy to like navigate through the transcript. The problem is it's stuck in Grain.
Right.
So like we saw a very fancy example of this recently, this company called Writer, that's an AI content SaaS company, was doing case studies, and there's audio and text together and like embedded within the blog post or sound bites you can click and it will take you to the right place in the audio version. I was like inspecting the code, trying to figure out how the heck. I was hoping I was going to find like some plugin or something that I could, but I didn't find it. It must be a custom thing, which is pretty slick, but I'm guessing also fairly expensive to build.
Yeah. I mean, that's right with all these tools. Like it's not just podcasting or transcription. You get stuck in their platform, which is what you want if you're building a business. You don't want people to just leave, but it complicates the actual usability of it. So
yeah. I wanted to circle back to Lindsay's question earlier on about promo for a new season. And I wanted to just ask you about audience size. So text content world, there's most people who lead content teams carry around kind of like a lingering, ongoing sense of anxiety that their site doesn't get enough traffic.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to benchmark that. Like most people don't really know. There is never enough. So there's that. But then there is two, it's hard to benchmark. So you don't really know how you're doing. So you just always assume it's not good enough. And I'll tell you, this happens so frequently. And then the way people think about growth goals is like, we want to double our traffic, or we want to get to 100,000 page views, or they kind of pick out these like big goals. And the nature of SEO is like, you probably can get there, but one, at what cost and how long will it take? And is it worth it? I don't know. It may not be worth it to pursue that specific goal. But audience size is like this thing. It's like this top line number that is really easy. Just like an easy soundbite that gets thrown around in meetings, and managers want to know about. Do you find the same thing in podcasting? How should you think about audience size? Like I got to assume there's a ceiling on it if it's B2B, right?
Yeah. So there is absolutely a ceiling, but just like in written content, the benchmarks don't really translate because every company is going to be in a different space, presenting ideally a different type of content or a different focal point of their show, and then has a different level of establishment as a brand already to attract an audience, is sourcing a different level of guests. So there's no benchmarks. I carry around that anxiety because I produce lots of podcasts. And so on behalf of all my clients, I have that anxiety. Are we driving enough traffic? Are these successful shows? And whether you work with Podsicle, you do it in-house, you work with another agency, for a long time, and this is kind of going to plug back into what I told you right before that we've been working on some analytics related stuff. For a long time, the answer has been, with anything related to audience, aside from the number of listeners, a shrug. We don't know. And I don't want to say too much because we're still in development, but I'm hoping that by the end of the year, we'll have rolled out a tool that should give people the kind of insights they expect from their blog content into podcasting. So
you're building this.
What's that?
Podsicle's building this.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
So some insights into the types of companies that are listening to your podcast, which companies are repeat listeners of your podcast. So there's going to be, and then of course the identities of those companies. So there's going to be opportunities for account-based marketing. But I would say if your company is not using podcasting as an ABM tool, then, and aside from also just being able to then, attribute that certain leads have listened to your podcast, the big advantage there is to say, week over week, is the audience that we're reaching getting closer and closer to our ideal customer profile. So if in January we were reaching 20% B2B companies, but by June we were reaching 30% B2B companies, that might not be top line audience growth, but that's efficiency in your audience growing. On the flip side, if those numbers are trending the wrong way, or are you wanting to focus on getting new companies to listen to your podcast every week, or do you want to create subscribers out of the companies that do listen? What's your goal? I think we're going to be able to get more granular about that pretty soon. And I'm very excited because that is something that I have had to, and all the other agencies have had to tell our clients is just not possible. It's not going to reinvent the wheel, but it's going to be enough to start using some data to say to your executive team, like, hey, this is not just cross your fingers and hope it turns into something we can measure it.
That's so cool. That's so cool. I'm really curious about that because like one of the things we find in content is that if you say, oh, we wrote a blog post and 100 people read it, it's like a complete failure. But if you can say, this person, this human being who lives in this place and has this job title and works at this company and it fits into our target demographic, like one of them read it, then people are like, oh, okay, cool. That's great. Like we're reaching the right people. It's just so funny. Like,
well, so that's the idea. If you're producing a podcast and let's say you're investing $3,000 a month into it, but your annual contract value is six figures, if your podcast accelerates one deal, it's a positive ROI. But if you don't know that, you can't justify it at all. So I can promise you this is not possible now. We can't do it, and nobody will ever be able to tell you the specific identity of a listener when it comes to, that's the content marketing lead at this company. But we can and will be able to tell you, hey, it is Superpath that's listening to this podcast.
That's interesting. And is that just because Apple and Spotify, like they keep that for themselves, basically?
Yeah. So like Spotify, Spotify and Apple, they know exactly who it is because they have the login information and they don't share that with us. But one of the great things about RSS feeds, and as much as I was blasting them a little bit earlier, is one of the workarounds is that you can basically add more scripts to your RSS feed. And so we're building out a tool that will allow you to add a script that is enriching a lot of that data. And then there's a lot more that goes into it. So there are tons of web bots that crawl podcasts. We have to filter all that out. So it's not just thousands and thousands of Google visits where they're just crawling your podcast feed and then turning that data into something that's actually valuable for the listener, for the producer. So we're working on it. I said more than I wanted to say, but I'm excited. So it's hard not to.
Do you have a rough timeline?
I'm hoping by the end of the year. We're going to do a beta with our clients in the next few months here. And then I'd like to have everything ironed out and ready to go by 2023.
That is really cool. That's such a powerful tool, and it's also just so like purpose built for your target customer, right?
I've always wanted to be. I'm entrepreneurial. That's why I founded my agency, and I've always wanted to build things. I'm really a builder more than I am an entrepreneur. The most fun part of starting Podsicle for me was building Podsicle. The execution of it is what I'm good at, and that's why I picked this space. But the fun of it was taking it from nothing to something. So I'm jumping right back into that. And the advice you'll always get from people in the startup world is go be a subject matter expert in an area until you have a problem and then solve the problem. And so I think that's really where this comes from, is like, we're producing podcasts and everybody has this problem. That means we need to solve it.
That's so cool. I love it. Are there any tools that you and the team use on a regular basis that you might recommend to other folks who?
Nothing magical. I'm hoping that this is going to be that tool for people, but we use, our distribution is on Sounder FM, but a lot of companies use Simplecast and Acast, and there's Sounder, and I just said Sounder, Anchor. And there's a lot of great ones like that. I don't think you can really go wrong with your hosting provider. Analytics, Chartable is great. That's probably the best analytics tool out there right now. And then, we use Rev for transcriptions, and the rest of it, our producers have different tools that they prefer. So some of our producers are using Audition. Other ones are, it's a whole suite of software that just, that's my management style, right? Deliverables focused, because that's what
that makes sense.
About. So if you can get the job done in Microsoft Word, you edit the podcast in Word. I don't know how you do it, but if you can do it, go for it. It's deliverables oriented.
Yeah. How about recording? Is Zoom good enough? I see Riverside out there now.
Great question. I should have actually said that. As far as magic tools existing, Riverside. We use Riverside. There are other great options out there, Squadcast, Iris. I definitely don't want to say that Riverside is the only option, but use a dedicated remote podcast recording tool, because the main upside there is that it's recording uncompressed, unaffected by the internet audio and video locally. So you're getting really high quality files after the recording is finished. And you can go to Riverside's website. They have a little sample of what it sounds like recorded on Zoom versus recorded on Riverside. It's a big difference.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. You can tell. I feel like when you queue up a podcast to listen to it and it was recorded in Zoom, you're like, oh my God,
yeah,
I'm gonna have to suffer through it. I mean, like I want to listen to it because it sounds interesting, but like I'm gonna have to suffer through some audio stuff here.
Well, so I mean, whenever you have a video call, right? Zoom compresses the audio and the video from both parties, sends that across the internet, potentially across the globe, and then that's getting captured. Versus in Riverside, they do the same thing, but that audio and video is only for the live experience between the two people who are talking. And then each person is having recorded on their local computer the raw audio that's uncompressed, that's not subject to any potential lag, and that then gets uploaded after the fact for the producers to come in and work with. So you have the benefit of a live call where it's compressing it for speed purposes, but then you're not using that audio in the end.
Yeah, that's sweet. Last I checked, their pricing was very reasonable.
Yeah, it's
also.
like $20 a month.
Yeah, it's crazy. I can't remember if we talked about Descript last time. Do you guys use Descript?
Yeah, so Descript first of all, it's incredible. I'll just say that from like what they've built from a technology standpoint, it's incredible, but it also is somewhat limited. And a lot of really good audio producers have spent years and years honing their craft on how to manually mix and master tracks to get the most out of them. And Descript, like any other AI tool, because that's ultimately what it is not quite there, but it's a lot better than anybody who hasn't done it before. So if you go into Descript, the best thing you can do, it makes it really easy to edit from a structural standpoint, to just see your podcast as a text document and cut it that way if you're not familiar with audio editing. That's powerful. And then they have this studio sound feature. This is really the part that I get focused on, which is almost there. Studio sound, you can feed it pretty bad audio, flip that switch on the control panel, and you will get much better audio.
That's cool.
Like much better. But if you apply studio sound at 100%, it's going to sound like people are either have a cold or are underwater. Or you're going to lose words that get cut out because it's doing all these little things 90% of the way there. And somebody who's technically skilled is always going to be better at that. But if you take your audio file, run it through Descript studio sound at 40%, you're going to get a substantial bump in quality without sacrificing a lot. And then you can pull it into whatever other audio program you'd be using to edit and make your manual tweaks from there. So I think it's really useful for getting you from the raw file, doing 40% of the work for you, and then leaving the other 60% to be done manually. Yeah. I wouldn't lean on it these days unless you have a really quality setup to do too much of the work, though.
Yeah, got it. Makes sense. Well, cool, Ryan. We're about up on our 45 minutes. Can you plug Podsicle? Like, let's send people there. Tell us the deal.
Podsiclemedia.com. We're a B2B podcast production agency. I am always available to chat with companies. Even if you're not going to work with us, you can tell me that straight up at the beginning, and I'm still happy to spend my time helping you out. I have a passion for this space, but I'd love to work with anybody who's interested. We do end-to-end soup to nuts podcast production. We help with the strategy, obviously the production side of things, making sure that everything's distributed. But Superpath has been a great community for me. And I want to, in the spirit of that, I want to be a community member. So you don't have to have any intent to work with us to reach out with any questions you might have. You can reach me directly in Superpath or on our website, podsiclemedia.com. And hopefully soon, podpixel.com for some cool podcast analytics tracking.
Awesome. We'll be in touch with you about that. And as that's rolling out, like, we're happy to let people know about it as well. Cool, Ryan, you've been just so generous with your time today and in our last AMA. So really, really appreciate that. We'll publish the recording, obviously, any links that got mentioned. We'll make sure we send people to Podsicle as well. And then we'll tag you in Slack. So
awesome.
Thank you. Huge value to the community. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Take care, everybody.
Bye.